So first of all, I just want to thank you. I know a lot of you have been praying for me just as we've been entering Romans. And if you haven't been with us for the last several weeks, we've been cracking probably the most thick, theologically rich book of the New Testament. You'd never want to say this book is more important than that book, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as from like a theological vantage point, the book of Romans really is the magnum opus of theology. It really does bring together so many loose threads and ties them together to show us the gospel. A couple weeks ago, we looked at how the opening verses of Romans is the most dense piece of literature in the Bible where the word gospel shows up 7 times in a very dense kind of a way. And so that's what Romans is about. It's about the gospel. And the gospel, as Paul says in Romans 1, is this revealing of God's righteousness. It's this sort of apocalyptic breaking in of God's righteousness. And that word righteousness is a pretty hefty term in itself. We've said over the last several weeks that righteousness is God's impartial justice, his rightness. I mean, righteousness is a courtroom word, right? So it's God's impartiality. It's his just rightness. But we've also said it's his covenant faithfulness. That to be righteous is not just to render a right verdict, it's to be faithful within a covenant relationship. And if you're faithful within a covenant relationship, you get the righteous stamp. And if you're not, you don't. So in one sense, righteousness, God's righteousness, the gospel, is incredibly good news because it says God has been faithful to us. God is a God who makes promises. Making promises, as you know, is easy. Keeping them is another matter. Whenever I do a wedding, I often say things like, you're here to make a promise to be wedded together, to be married, and yet, and I am careful with this, but I say something along the lines of, depending on the couple, right now, you're not the kind of person that can keep this promise. Marriage is actually the institution that will create the kind of person, the kind of character to keep this vow, because we know you love each other today, but what about in 30 years? You're going to actually have to become the kind of person that can keep this promise that you're making now. And what we see throughout the Bible is that the gospel is incredibly good news, and yet it's also incredibly bad news. Because the story of the world that Paul tells in Romans is that while God has been faithful, it's to a people that have been unfaithful. How in the world does God bring about his righteousness, his impartiality, his justice, his covenant faithfulness, and still emerge with a people? If we're all in the wrong and he's in the right, how does he do it? That's the story of Romans. He does it through Jesus. Because there was one faithful one, and he is rendered a right verdict, a covenant faithful verdict, a righteousness verdict. And when we put our faith in that faithfulness, we stand in his company. We stand in the right. Underneath all of that is the sense of what we looked at last week, which is God's wrath. Now, again, like last week, I know that you probably didn't get up this morning going, boy, I hope we hear about wrath again today. Isaac told me he's never heard a sermon on wrath. And I'm going, wow. Because there's actually something very fascinating, something counterintuitive, something actually rather lovely about preaching about God's wrath. The thing that's actually wonderful and lovely about God's wrath is when we tell the story of Jesus, it's a story of God absorbing his own wrath for us. In the one sense, God's wrath tells us that sin matters to God. That God's wrath, as we defined last week, is his settled opposition to evil. This is not God being capricious. This is not God being unpredictable. This is God's settled opposition to evil and injustice. That's good news, except when we're the ones who have been unjust. That's why we have to get to Jesus, because Jesus, and we're not actually going to get to Jesus until Romans 3. So that's why I keep alluding to it, because in the flow of the argument of Romans, we don't actually get to the good news until Romans 3:21. So we've got like 3 weeks to get there. We got to keep the gospel in front of us because it's pretty dark for the next couple of weeks. What I want to do is look at the passage that we looked at last week. If you were here with us last week as we began to look at this wrath that's connected to God's righteousness, you probably noticed that I stepped over or looked past One thing that surfaces in the text that's pretty obvious. A couple of you even said, why didn't you talk about that? And it's like, well, because we needed to lay the groundwork first so we could stay focused, so that we didn't just go to the red flashing light and just turn it off or say, but we have to go to we don't have to. In fact, it would be easier just to go to Romans 2. I'd be lying to you if I say I want to go to Romans 2. But I also just don't think we would be capturing an opportunity to talk about the same-sex sexuality that emerges in Romans 1. And we need to talk about it because everybody else is talking about it. I think we should talk about it. One of the things I know is that this issue of same-sex sexuality hits really close to home. This is not an issue. This is not something that's just out there somewhere. I know that it's in here. I know that you have friends, like I have friends. I know that you have family, like I have family. I know that you have coworkers, children, and grandchildren who are same-sex sexuality oriented. I know that. So I want to start by just saying we cannot talk about this like this is just an issue. In fact, you might be here this morning and you've got a proclivity to that. You might be all in on it right now. And what I want to just ask is 2 questions. What kind of a church do we want to be for that community? What kind of a church do we want to be? This is always dangerous when I give you the mic. I'm not saying shout out an answer. I just want you to think about it. What kind of a church do we want to be? And as I've been thinking about that question, a couple things have come to my mind. What would the book of Romans tell us about what kind of church we should be? What would the gospel that Romans talks about compel us to be? I'm compelled to think of the fact that, like in the Gospel of John, it says Jesus came full of grace and, finish it for me, truth. Grace and truth. That the thing with, if we take that same definition for righteousness, that is a definition for righteousness. It's grace for unfaithfulness that by its very nature is deeply transformative. I think we need to be a church family because we know this is personal. We know how close this is. It might be so close that it's in us right now, not just in our family members. However we talk about this, it's going to be from a place of love and compassion and grace and truth. And what I find in ministry and in life is what makes Jesus so compelling is he does both of those at the same time. Because we could go to one end of the spectrum and just go all grace and no truth, and we would be missing the mark. We could go to the other end of the spectrum and be all truth and no grace, and we'd miss the mark. What we have to see is that the gospel is both of those at the same time. Let me say one more short prayer as we wade in and read Romans 1. Let's pray. Here we are, Lord, and your word is so good. And I ask that you would help my words and my heart. You'd help my friends that are here as we put ourselves under your word. I know I'm tempted over and over again to put myself over your word. You know, Lord, how when I'm in my study, sometimes it's hard to find my Bible in the stack of books. Somehow it's on the bottom and all the commentaries are on top, and yet we want your word to be on top. Wherever our hearts are at this morning, Lord, I just pray you'd help us to be open. We might learn something today, something that's new. We might be challenged in a way that's new. We love you. We're so thankful that you say things that we really do need to hear, and we ask you to help us want to hear them. It's in your name. Amen. All right, so chapter 1, verse 18, I want to read the passage. And the thing about this same sexuality piece, now that I've kind of got you primed to be hearing it, looking for it, is there's so much to say here. In fact, I found myself just in my piles of notes wanting to say everything I know about this and bring the stack of books up that I've read and am reading because I don't have all the answers. I want us to stay focused. There's actually 2 things, and only 2, time permitting, that I want to try to draw our attention to. One of my professors talked about disciplined reading, meaning stay in the text. Let the text guide the way that you think about whatever it is you're looking at in the text. So I really want to do that. I want to draw out two things from the text. So let's read the text together. Chapter 1, verse 18, Paul writes, the wrath, right, the settled opposition to injustice, the wrath of God is being revealed, present tense, from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness, or as we talked about last week, the injustice of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness or injustice. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images, made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these things, but they approve of those who practice them. This is God's word. The thing that I really want to draw out, really two things. The first thing that I want to draw out is what Paul does in this passage is he draws out same-sex sexuality as a sexual sin, but he draws it out not as a sin that causes a breach in our relationship with God. Let me say that again. In Paul's mind, this is not the sin, nor is any other sin, the sin that causes the breach in our relationship with God. Sexual sin, in whatever way, shape, or form, in fact, he alludes to that in verse 24, that we're not just talking about same-sex sexuality. We're talking about sex that's gone outside the normative biblical grounds of within the safety and context of marriage, of covenant, of vow, loving across difference, loving across the gender. I mean, we all know that there's a lot of ways that sex can go bad and go wrong, right? There isn't just one. I mean, pick one. But what Paul does is he actually situates same-sex sexuality in the same category as every other sin. That every other sin, including same-sex sexuality, is not the cause of our breach in our relationship with God. I'm using language from one of my favorite authors, Rosaria Butterfield, who was a tenured professor at Syracuse, lesbian for 20 years, had this train wreck conversion, came to Christ. Rosaria Butterfield, she's an incredibly sharp thinker. She was an English professor for a long time, just incredibly sharp thinker. But she uses this language to draw out Paul's argument that sin, same-sex sexuality, sin, or any other sin is not the cause of the breach. It's a consequence of it. It's a consequential sin, meaning it flows out of a sin that's already taken place. Right? It's not the thing that we often say, boy, you fix this or else you and God cannot come together. You cannot connect. You cannot have a relationship with him. That's not the way Paul thinks. When Paul draws out same-sex sexuality, he sees it as a consequence of a much bigger sin, not a cause. So we might ask the question, well, what's the cause? Well, as we said last week, and we just need to touch it again here briefly, notice what the cause is. Verse 18 and 19 are very helpful here. It says that God's wrath, God's settled opposition to injustice, is being revealed against people, all people. Not just those people. I'm talking about all people. All people who suppress the truth of their injustice, their wickedness. They suppress the truth that there is, in fact, an all-powerful, all-good, all-loving God who has made the world and is sustaining us. And as Doug drew our attention to in the announcements, there is someone to thank for this day. I mean, it's a beautiful, glorious day. And in February, when we've had liquid sunshine for 8 weeks and we're like, where is the sun? That is still a day, even though we wake up and we go, Lord, get us to June. That is still a day where we wake up and we thank because it's a day that God has made. There is someone to thank. What Paul says is the cause in our breach, in our relationship with God, is twofold. One, we suppress a truth that is deep in our bones. It's like hardwired into who we are. And Paul says, God has revealed enough of himself to where we don't have, not everybody has all the information, but we've got enough that we're accountable, and we hold that down. We suppress the truth that there is someone to thank, and rather than thanking him, we actually hold that truth in. And as we said last week, that's actually a grave injustice. God is not insecure, and he's saying, why won't they worship me? Look what I've done. They don't love me. No. It's a fact that he is worthy of that, and to not give that to him is a grave injustice. He's actually worth that. He's worthy of it. It's the most fitting thing to do when you come into his presence. And we, first of all, we hold that down. We hold that, literally, we hold it back. We actively hold that back. We come up with all kinds of schemes and ways to hold back the praise that God righteously deserves. And so we hold that back. And then secondly, we actually are forced to worship something else. Notice how Paul very immediately goes to idolatry. Because see, the question in the Bible is not whether you worship or not. The question is, what are you going to worship? We're made in the image of a God that is constantly pouring himself out to himself, Father, Son, and Spirit. We are made in the image one who's always wanting to glorify someone, glorify something, or looking to something to make us right, something to make us well, something to give us security, something to give us identity. And so when Paul says the cause of our breach of our relationship with God is not same-sex sexuality, it's actually first and foremost holding down what we were made to do, which was glorify him. And when we refuse to do that, we will glorify something. It will not be stopped. I mean, Paul uses the idolatry in his day, and while we might not bow down to idols today in the form of like a statue of stone or gold, like much of the world, we happily bow down to the things that we look to make us well. Our job, our education, our training, our standing, our retirement. I mean, pick one. Your health. How do you know when you've poured yourself out to something besides God? When it's taken away, you absolutely crash. How do you know when something has become your everything? Not just a good thing, but an ultimate thing. It's when it gets wobbled, you freak out. It's not like, oh, that's tough, but we're going to make it through. It's like everything comes down when that idol starts shaking, or if it falls over. Like if you lost your entire 401k, rather than being really upset and really distraught, but man, God's still on the throne and we're okay, you are absolutely lost forever. That's when you know. How do you know when your health has become so important to you that it's not just something that's good, but it's ultimate? When you go to the doctor and they say, we're going to need to order some more tests. And rather than going, okay, you just completely lose everything. See, we're just as accustomed to idolatry today. It just takes on a lot of different forms. And so what Paul really wants to show us is with same-sex sexuality right now, because even though that's like the buzzword for us, this is not new. right? In the ancient world then and even before, right, this was very much a thing. It might not have been institutionalized the way that it is in our world, but it was very common. It was looked at as not necessarily normative, but it was a part of their world in the ancient Near East, okay? But what Paul really wants us to do is to think critically about this. This is not the worst sin. This is a sin of consequence. There's actually a much graver sin that everybody's committed. Holding back, suppressing the truth of God and replacing it with something else. In talking with a handful of you over the last couple of weeks, somebody actually approached me and said, now that we're looking at this like the way that Paul lays out his argument, a gal approached me and said, this is going to change the way I pray for one of my family members. I said, wow, do tell. I'm really interested. This is going to change because I'm not going to pray for a family member that's struggling with her identity with same-sex sexuality because that's important, but it's not the sin that really needs to be taken care of. And I thought, wow, you're getting it. One person is getting it. Thank you, Jesus, right? Well, what I heard her saying was, yeah, that's a problem, but it's in Rosaria Butterfield's language, that same-sex sexuality is really a consequence. It's not the cause. We need to get to the root. We need to get to the root of the matter. And the root of the matter is there has been a grave injustice. And she actually used the word rebellion. And I said, that's your word, that's dangerous talk there. But I thought, you're onto it. Do you know that outside of Christ, we're all rebels? You know that? If you've never thought of yourself as a rebel of God, as his enemy, you don't know the gospel. You don't know the gospel yet. Only when you come to grips with the fact that you are a rebel, an enemy, that God, you're a traitor. I'm a traitor, that we've gone rogue. And God, in his mercy, has stepped down into an enemy fortress, into an enemy kingdom, and he's brought us into his fold. The sacrifice of his only son, the one who was faithful and true and was punished for it. If you haven't thought of yourself in those terms, the gospel has not lighted into your heart yet. And I pray that it does, and I pray that it's doing so now. I want to stay focused. What Paul is saying is that, yes, same-sex sexuality is a deviation from the pattern. It's a deviation from the plan, but it's not the worst kind. If you read the last part of chapter 1, there's a lot of other things that he spends probably more attention to, and it's a really ugly list, and I don't want to read it again. You read it on your own time. Okay? So it's a sin of consequence. It's not a sin of cause. Friends, if we really want to let the gospel do its good work in hearts, we got to quit wrestling with consequences. We got to quit telling people to clean this up, clean that up. We've got to go right to the heart. And I realize that's actually harder. It's actually harder. It's actually harder to go to somebody and say, that's small potatoes. You have a much bigger problem than your same-sex sexuality. Oh, that's just downstream from a much bigger thing. Do you believe that actually in your heart of hearts, you're holding down? You're refusing to give God the rightful glory and justice that are due his name. Do you believe that your greatest sin is not your sexuality, it's your unbelief? You refuse to give your deepest allegiance to someone who lets you breathe today, that you owe him everything, not just your body and your sexuality. You owe him everything. So same-sex sexuality it's a consequence. It's not a cause. We really need to get that in our mind, okay? As we're thinking through and listening to our friends, our family members, we go, man, okay, we don't need to have the battle of right or wrong. That's a part of it. But we need to be thinking in terms of, but where do we situate this conversation in the bigger flow of the story of the gospel? The second thing that I really want to draw our attention to is that same-sex sexuality, how do I want to say this? Same-sex sexuality takes its root in the life of the mind long before it takes its root in the life of the body. The reason I can say that is because if you notice what Paul does is he always talks about when he hands us over to what we want, right? We over-desire, not just same-sex sexuality, but when we over-desire anything that's out of bounds from the God-given good life, when we over-desire any of that, God, 3 times he says it, he hands us over. And in handing us over, it actually has a deep impact on our mind. Because now that we're worshiping false gods instead of the one true God, an incredible breach has taken place, and it's affecting our minds. That whenever you read about idolatry in the Bible, I mean, Isaac alluded to this last week, whenever you worship something less than God, you become like what you worship. So that's why being an image bearer of a holy God is so important, because we were made to reflect the incredible complexity, the beauty, the justice of a holy God. And when we refuse to give that worship there and we give it to somewhere else, we will inevitably become like what we worship. One of the great connections that idolatry does throughout the scriptures is when you worship things of stone, birds and animals and creeping things, the connection that the Bible makes is our hearts and our minds become like stone. We actually become less human. We become less of an image bearer, if not an image bearer altogether. We become able to not reflect the incredible beauty and complexity of God's character, because now we're worshiping things of stone that we've made, and it deeply affects our minds. It affects the way we think, not only about God, but about ourselves. Notice the connection that Paul makes with not just same-sex sexuality, though that's at the forefront for our discussion today, but just idolatry in general. Notice verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking, our minds become futile, and our foolish hearts are darkened. Look at verse 28. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind. Same-sex sexuality, it's a consequence of the original sin. It's a consequence of the great cause. But one thing that comes with it is our minds are not the same. Our minds aren't thinking right. Our minds are not thinking straight. The word in verse 21, God gave them over to thinking that became futile. It's really quite sobering. That word futile literally means fictitious and even deceitful. That we start living a fiction when we commit idolatry, when we create this breach in our relationship with God, and in this case, same-sex sexuality flows downstream from that, we begin living a fiction. We begin living in a world of our own making, and it's incredibly deceptive. Have you ever talked to somebody who's self-deceived? I mean, everybody can see it but them. How do you get them out of that? I mean, you can't. You can't help, they can't see it. By very definition, they're stuck because they don't see that they're this way, whatever way, whether it's they talk too much or they're too boisterous or they're rude or they're mean, they just don't see it. Paul says a consequence of this breach in our relationship with God is we start living a fiction. We start living an untruth, and it's incredibly deceptive. And it not only gets into us as individuals, it can actually get into entire groups, entire cultures. This idea of same-sex sexuality is not happening in a neutral mind, in a neutral culture. One of the things that we tend to forget in our day is that we have inherited a great life of the mind from, ages gone past, but for the last 300 years, the inheritance we've been given about the way to think about what it means to be human is not neutral. One book that I've found, and I'll just give you a little commercial note here. Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Put your seatbelt on if you want a challenging read. But The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Carl Trueman makes this very compelling case that where we are today did not happen by accident. It's the result of about 300 years of a confluence of a variety of thinkers, poets, scholars, scientists. That what we've got are the combined influences of people like Wordsworth and Percy Bysshe Shelley and Nietzsche and Marx and Freud. And what he does in the book is he makes this incredible, compelling case that roughly about 300 years ago, our concept of the human self went from being, and this was stock and standard for 1,700 years, and that doesn't mean that we were perfectly sinless in there, but the basic understanding, the basic framework of what it meant to be human was that we were a gendered image bearer of a holy God. We were a gendered image bearer of a holy God with an incredible amount of privileges and rights and responsibilities. And they were all hardwired into that. A gendered image bearer of a holy God. What Carl Trueman does in his book is he basically makes the case that over about 300 years, with the combination of all these people, the transcendent connection that we had with our identity, the fundamental nature of our incalculable and infinite worth, the thought that we were not just machines walking around with some flesh on us, that we aren't just mechanistic, determinative things. We are living, breathing, gendered image bearers of a holy God. One of the connections he makes in the book is that over the years, there's been 3 basic transitions, and I know we're not here to talk about Carl Trueman, but just hang with me for just a moment. The 3 basic transitions that he says the last 300 years have given us in the life of the mind is that we began to conceive of personhood and being a human in highly psychological terms first, then into highly sexualized terms second, and then highly politicized terms third. That the idea of what it means to conceive of a person or a self began to be dominantly conceived of in terms of what we think, and then secondly with our sexuality, and then third with our politics. And I can't go down into all the details, but I look at that and I go, wow, I can see it. I can see it. That what it means to be a self or a person is not bound by some of the biological terms. It's really what you want or what you think. It's in your mind. Your identity is crafted in your mind. And the biology has something to do with it, but fundamentally who you are is something that's in your mind. It's everything else is either leading into that or it's leading away from it. But the decision is yours. The decision is yours. Your identity, your selfhood is built on your psychology. And then secondly, the heart, the meat of his argument, along comes Freud, right, the father of modern psychology, and he actually makes an incredibly determinative move by making our identity decidedly sexual. That everything in our life is decided by our sexual desires, feeding our sexual desires, that he even says that our personhood is definitive on our pursuit of happiness, and our pursuit of happiness is deeply connected to sex. What he does is he takes sexuality from being a component of our identity, a component of being a gendered image bearer of a holy God, and he brings it and makes it the Holy Grail. This isn't a facet of who you are. This is determinative of who you are. When you combine that with my identity is basically fixed in what I want it to be in my mind, I'm going to connect that to sexuality, and then you strap it to the atom bomb of politics. What we need to realize is that this is absolutely novel. Never before has the world thought about individual persons, individual selves in these terms. One of the things we need to realize is the life of the mind, that the inheritance we've been given for the last 200 to 300 years in the life of the mind, the way we think about who we are is not neutral. One of the reasons I know that is because in the Bible, same-sex sexuality is not a category of personhood. That's a fancy way of saying sex was always something you did. It wasn't who you are. Every time the Bible talks about same-sex sexuality, it's something that's done. It's not an identity marker. It's not there's straight people and there's gay people. I know I might be stepping on toes right here, but when the Bible talks about it, it's always people who do same-sex acts. This is not an identity marker. This is something that is done. It's not who you are. I can't think of a much more loaded statement than that right now in our culture. And I will say, afterward, if you have questions, I don't pretend to have this all pinned down, but if there's something that a button that I'm pushing you, I want to ask more, or I'm really furious at that statement, or the statement he made 3 minutes ago, Or I woke up and that's the first thing I heard, and man, I'm angry. I want to talk with you about it because I can't get it all out right now, right? I have been thinking on this for a while, but I don't pretend to have all the answers. What I do know is that when the Bible talks about this, it talks about it from that angle. What I think in our modern world, one of our greatest idols is that we feel like we have to come up with an identity on our own. Do you not see when you look into the eyes of those that you love that are struggling with same-sex sexuality, or that aren't struggling at all? They're happy and they're free and they don't look back. Can you not hear the undercurrent of how much they bolt everything on to that? That rather than it being a facet of who we are, it is the high note. It is the center of mass. Everything is, this is who I am. How are you going to argue with that? I mean, that's like, I can't think of anything more personal. I can't think of anything that is just, don't go there, because this is not something I do. This is, you're fundamentally against me. And yet, we have to say, actually, there's something far richer that you are. I know that you're just scraping and you're searching for something to just give you a sense of well-being, something of a sense of I'm okay if I've got this, and you've latched on to this. And frankly, friends, it's one of many things, anything. Do you not know that we're all captive to this sin outside of Christ? Not just of same-sex sexuality. We're all searching for something to make us okay. We're all looking for something to identify, to say, if I've got this, I'm going to bolt my entire identity around, we were poor when I was growing up, but you know what? I'm financially secure now. That is who I am. I was always just unhealthy as a kid, and I struggled with diabetes and this and that, but man, I've got that licked, and now I'm healthy, and man, nothing can stop me now. I'm a healthy person. That is who I am. I never liked the career that my parents had, and I just never felt like they were never happy. And so, man, I'm going to school because I'm going to be X, Y, and Z, because that is who I am. See, this same-sex sexuality, striving for identity, is not just endemic to same-sex sexuality. It's all of us. Do you realize that if you cut ties with a holy God as being the person from whom your identity flows, that your everything flows from that source, you are doomed to make an idol out of something and to make your entire life wrap around it and say, this is my identity. This is who I am. But that sin, whatever sin it is, whether it's same-sex sexuality or anything else, that starts in the life of the mind long before it gets into the life of our bodies. Have you experienced this? Do you know this? Are you making any connections? See, what Paul does in Romans 1 is he's not nearly as concerned about same-sex sexuality as we are. Paul does not write Romans 1 so that we can look at other people's sins. What Paul does in Romans 1 is he writes Romans 1 so that we can see ourselves. Do you believe that? Yes. See, if we read Romans 1 and we see ourselves, I think we can be a people that are full of grace and full of truth, because sexual sin in whatever form is not the cause. It's just a consequence. This pattern has been in the life of the mind long before the life of the body. And if we believe that Paul wrote Romans 1, and I think we do, not to see others, but to see ourselves, and I think we're setting ourselves up to hear the gospel. That we're far more wicked than we ever believed and far more loved than we can ever imagine.